I will take you with me. You might learn something.
About soccer?
Nah, mate. Not about soccer. And for fuck's sake, stop saying soccer!
Grüß Gott, and welcome to the Assistant Professor of Football. The conversations in this podcast are meant for those who get that soccer is more than the game day, the stars, the goals. Who see European games on TV and wonder about what actually goes on in these stadiums and on these terraces. About the histories and politics that make soccer in Europe so different from American sports cultures. And about a critical take on soccer as a global capitalist machine. There's so much media, so many podcasts that will tell you their take on Holland and Aronson and Bayern and Barcelona, garnished with some sportsy banter. But there is only one, perhaps, that will tell you why Manchester United supporters founded a rival, member-owned club, how anti-fascist supporters are reshaping fan cultures from Hamburg, Germany to Florence, Italy, or how soccer explains what is currently going on in the Ukraine. In this first episode, I'm talking to Matt Ford. Matt is from Manchester, an active United supporter, season ticket holder, critical fan journalist, and a professional journalist by day as well for the English-speaking public broadcasting service of Germany. And he now lives in Germany too. I wanted to talk to Matt so he could give me the inside scoop about the protests among Manchester United fans against that club's owners, particularly the events of May 2nd, 2021, that led to the league game against Liverpool being cancelled just in the wake of the proposal for the European Super League. You may remember that. A lot of important dynamics intersect here. Super League versus League Pyramid, ownership system versus members-owned club, soccer clubs as global brands versus community assets, etc. I remember it was a Sunday when those protests happened. I was sitting at home on the couch, and as things were unfolding, I wrote something in the chat group I'm a part of with soccer-interested friends from work and from church here. And I said something like, yes, finally a protest that hits the soccer capitalists where it hurts. Finally, grassroots fans are standing up, and so on. And one of my friends, who I really like and respect, wrote back that he didn't see things that way at all. That these pictures from Manchester reminded him of January 6th in Washington, D.C., right? A mob of men storming property that wasn't theirs. And my first reaction was to say, what in the world, how can you think this? This is heroic, we all ought to support these protests. But then I thought, here it is, that space between how we perceive soccer and how we perceive what's at stake in the game. Between my impulses from growing up with soccer in Europe and the no less intelligent way of reflecting on the game here among smart and progressive and soccer-interested folks in the US. This story, in a nutshell, captures why I want to do this podcast and why it's fitting that we begin it in Manchester, May 2021, with Matt Ford. Since this is the first episode of the Assistant Professor of Football, before we dive in, bear with me for a minute so you have an idea who is talking to you and why. My name is Philip Gollner, and I am an actual college professor at a liberal arts college in the Midwest. Just not of football, but of US history. That is mostly what I teach, but also on the concepts and ideas of doing history. And I'm not American. I am Austrian, not Australian, Austrian, and came to the US for graduate school and stayed in a beautiful community in Goshen, Indiana, 2 hours east of Chicago, with 2 daughters and 2 cats. And I really like it here. But what ties me to Europe still, other than my family, is soccer, or proper football. I grew up as a member and active supporter of Sturm Graz, an Austrian side that's also engaged in the Europa League this season. I'm still a member, and when I'm back in Austria, I love to return to the supporters culture in the stadium. As an undergrad student in Munich, I followed 1860 Munich, now in the third league in Germany, including some memorable away trips. And during a summer in London, in graduate school, I fell in love with West Ham United's old stadium, Upton Park, and then the club and its history itself, even though I tried hard to avoid the Premier League and its big money. But here we are. These two are communities and histories that continue to shape me. And this podcast exists because I believe that my people here in the US, good friends who really know a lot about soccer, and those supporter communities in Europe aren't parallel worlds. That there is, in fact, a lot of mutual curiosity both ways, and a lot of space to explore. And if you keep listening, I think we can have a lot of fun to explore them together. Hopefully twice a month, that's the plan. Also, a very quick word of housekeeping here. If you have comments, good or bad, I would love to hear them. Contact me on Twitter under the Assistant Professor of Football, just like the podcast. And I would like to keep the space free of ads and paywalls. If you know somebody who would like this kind of coverage of European soccer, and you think, yes, this really does fill a gap, by all means, spread the word over social media or just forward the link via old-fashioned email. Even better, tell someone in person. And if you want to leave some stars ratings at the podcast platform of your choice, that would be extremely helpful, because only then people can actually find what I'm doing here. But most of all, I'm very grateful you found the Assistant Professor of Football and are spending an hour with me and Matt Ford. And now, without further ado, we go to Manchester, May 2021.
Because honestly, what they did 2 weeks ago was really dangerous for English football. We must not forget that. They tried to walk away and create a closed-shop league that would have basically created a famine in this country for every other football.
A lot of fans out there have just had enough and who have been peaceful and who have turned up to protest against the owners of Manchester United. And we have to say to them, listen, you're standing up for your football club.
But let's not forget what this is. This is against this football club's ownership. You get a few idiots. I'm going back further since when I was a kid and how football fans were treated and how they were portrayed in the media, basically, on the back of a few idiots.
Hi, Matt, and thank you for being the visiting professor on here for today. Before we roll out a little bit of a cultural history of Manchester United in the last couple of decades and the protests, could you give me a little bit of your football supporters' biography? How did you get started? On what grounds would I find you on weekends right now? What's your story?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. My name's Matt. Nowadays I work as a football journalist based in Germany, largely covering German football and German fan culture. But originally I'm from Manchester. It's where I grew up, in a decidedly red household. So there was never really a choice of which team in Manchester I'd support. Grew up about 6-7 miles away from Old Trafford, and as a child, I suppose I used to go maybe 1, 2, 3 games a season, largely depending on what my dad could afford to take me to, because it was never particularly cheap. Even in the late 90s and early 2000s, you were looking at probably the best part of £100 for 2 tickets, travel, food, match day programme, all the things that are involved, which is not a small amount of money. So my first Man United game was actually in 1998, which turned out to be the season in which Manchester United won a unique and unprecedented treble. So I chose a pretty good year to start. However, it wasn't actually until I went to university, quite a few years later, that I started going really, really regularly myself. Just because it just so happens that when you go to university, you get grants and student loans. So I suddenly had money to spend and to be able to afford to go and watch football in England, which, like I said, it's not the cheapest pastime, particularly compared to Germany, where I am now. But that's a topic for another day. The longer I kept going, regularly home matches, away matches, matches away in Europe as well. I became involved in the fanzine culture, and I've been writing for a fanzine called United We Stand now for 7 or 8, 9 years or so. We're probably the biggest Manchester United fanzine, established in 1989. We cover a whole range of topics in print and also in digital, everything related to Manchester United, the city of Manchester, music in Manchester, politics in Manchester, fashion in Manchester, you name it. So it's not just the football on the pitch. It's a bit of a, it's reporting on all the topics that might interest Manchester United fans on and off the pitch, and yeah, it was doing that sort of amateur writing, and almost on a voluntary basis, which led me eventually to try and make a career out of it. And having studied German at university, I decided to move to Germany permanently and make the writing thing not just an amateur Man United based hobby, but try and make a career out of it. So that sort of brings us up to date, I think.
Now that you live in Germany, do you have a German soccer love as well?
I do have a German team. The first city that I went to while I was studying was Leipzig, and at the time my housemate was a supporter of Lokomotive Leipzig. So ever since then, for the past 10 years, I've actually been a fan and a member of Lokomotive Leipzig.
Yeah.
Nowadays in the fourth division. Just about pro. We're more than semi-pro. We're just about professional for the past few seasons. But it's a completely different level. But there's also a link there, because when I moved to Leipzig, I discovered that actually a good friend nowadays as well, who I actually randomly met in the pub, was from Leipzig, and he had actually spent time in Manchester a couple of years earlier watching FC United of Manchester, which is, I'm sure, a topic which we'll come on to. And by that point, I'd also been watching FC United of Manchester for a couple of years. And the two clubs actually played a friendly against each other in 2006. But in terms of Man United, I still get back. I'm based in Germany nowadays, but I still get back to Manchester, maybe about 4 or 5 times a year, usually around Christmas. So I get to a couple of home games or domestic away games then. Other than that, I get to I use my advantageous location in Germany to get to all the European away games in the Champions League, or these days Europa League, because we're not that good. So yeah,
what was your last
how
one?
I keep in touch. Just last week I got back from Moldova, where we played Sheriff Tiraspol. So I've just got back from Moldova.
Very nice. All right, let's go back to Sunday, May 2nd, 2021. The soccer world is debating the proposal of a number of wealthy European clubs to create a super league apart from the current league system. And the duel between Manchester United and Liverpool is on to cap the Premier League game day on that particular Sunday in a very TV-friendly fashion to be watched around the world. And news are trickling out that the game may not be able to be played because fans who are protesting the Super League and the owners of Manchester United aren't just protesting outside of the stadium. They've actually gone inside and stormed the pitch and stormed the terraces. And there is unrest, and TV speaks about chaotic scenes, and a few TV figures begin to be quietly sympathetic about what's going on. And for onlookers, the whole scene is just surprising. You, I'm sure, weren't super surprised. How do you remember that Sunday?
Yeah, I wasn't actually in Manchester on that particular Sunday. However, I had been covering the developments around the Super League as a journalist. I can't remember the exact dates. It must have been 5 or 6 days earlier, maybe even the Sunday before or 2 weeks earlier, because we basically worked non-stop for those mental 48 hours. Although I was obviously, from a work point of view, covering it largely from a German angle and the Borussia Dortmund and Bayern Munich angles in that, and would they get involved, would they not? And again, that's probably also a topic for another day, the whole German response to that. However, the United-Liverpool game, then, it wasn't the first game to get called off, or at which there had been protests. There had been protests at the Chelsea home game. I can't remember who they were playing, but there had been protests outside that game. And there had also been protests at, I believe, the Leeds versus Liverpool, I think the week before. That had been Liverpool, or a few days before that had been there. That had been the last game, because these games were all behind closed doors, of course, remember, as well. This was during the pandemic restrictions. So these games were all behind closed doors, but there were actually, I believe, about a coachload of Liverpool fans who went to Leeds, even though they couldn't go to the game, but in order to protest. And obviously all the fans were sort of up in arms about that. I believe the Leeds players even had T-shirts warming up on the pitch saying football for the fans or something along those lines. And then obviously a lot of the attention was directed on this big game that was then coming up, because it would have been obviously Man United versus Liverpool is it's the biggest fixture in English football. And it also so happens that I think it's fair to say that United and Liverpool have probably the most organised and perhaps in elements most militant supporter bases of probably any football club in England. There might be a few who would perhaps come close, but I think mainly based on the cities that they're both from. Manchester and Liverpool, we might be massive rivals, but actually very similar cities, very historically militant, very historically socialist, very historically proud and independent, and so that feeds through into the support of the two football clubs. So there was definitely the prospect that something could go on, that there would be some sort of protest against the Super League, particularly because obviously the two current ownerships of United and Liverpool were two of the main drivers behind the Super League plan. So the Glazer family, who own Manchester United, and FSG Group, and under John Henry, who own Liverpool, they were two of the major driving forces behind the Super League. It was very much the American owners who were driving this in conjunction with their Spanish and Italian colleagues. So yeah, when it actually came to the game itself, there were effectively two groups. There was the major general protest, people turning out, outside the stadium itself. But there was also a much smaller but much more organised and much more militant group with a specific plan outside the hotel, which is actually just over the docks from Old Trafford, like where the stadium is. It's about maybe about a 25-minute walk. That's where Man United, where the players and the staff spend the evening before the game. And it was there that a smaller but much more hardcore group had effectively barricaded the squad in the hotel. Not that there was never going to be any danger towards the actual players. I believe that was a concern among some of the security at the time. There could actually be a threat to the players. It was quite quickly made clear that that the players probably couldn't be safer. They were being barricaded in the hotel by the people who loved them the most. So there's probably never going to be any actual danger to the players. Meanwhile, at the ground itself, at the stadium itself, as far as I was concerned, and as far as I remember as well, there were never actually any specific plans to actually, enter the stadium and even get the game called off. That was never really a specific plan. However, the way things developed and the way the security just seemed completely unprepared and seemed to just fall away, and a few doors were opened around the stadium, it suddenly became apparent that people could just walk in. This is at least from what I heard on the ground. And it got to the point where people were a good few hundred, maybe even up to 1,000, were able to enter the stadium, and congregated on the pitch. Some even approached the tunnel. A very small number managed to actually get inside the tunnel and towards the dressing rooms. And the ultimate reason for the game being called off was that by doing that, certain COVID hygiene protocols had been breached. I believe that was actually the ultimate reason why the game was then called off, because they couldn't guarantee that these hygiene areas during COVID had remained intact. Which, I think maybe it sounds daft looking back, but that was the world we were living in at the time. Next thing you know, the biggest game in English football, arguably one of the biggest games in world football, had been called off with the eyes of the world watching.
Could you take me into the crowd a little bit? Who are these fans? You mentioned the price point of attending Man United regularly is pretty high, and yet I saw a lot of young people in that crowd as well, and there seemed to be both a sense of being very alienated from the club, but also really, really invested in it. Who is there?
A lot of these people can't afford these games, so the demographic that turned up was actually a demographic which, to large parts, perhaps actually hadn't been going to games, but still felt moved enough. I think not just disillusioned by Yeah, disillusioned by three things, I suppose. In the longest term, by general Premier League developments in top-flight English football, going back to the early 90s. In the medium term, by the Glazer ownership of Manchester United. And in the immediate short term, the Super League plans, which had happened just a week before. So those three things certainly struck a chord with a local demographic in Manchester.
So what's happening here is that these things combine into a perfect storm for fans, right? I mean, if anybody had ever any doubt about what the Glazers' truest interest was in getting invested in Manchester United, this whole Super League scenario demonstrates that quite clearly, right?
Very much so. I mean, the entire point of the Glazer ownership since 2005 is that they use Manchester United as a cash machine. From their point of view, it works extremely successfully. They have taken, I think the figures vary depending on which factors you factor in, but certainly over £1 billion. They've taken that out of Manchester United since 2005, whether in the form of dividend payments. They're the only owners in the Premier League who take any dividends, or in the form of debt repayments or debt restructuring measures. So all this money's been taken out. What they do with that money precisely back home in the United States, I'm not too sure. I think at various periods over the past 17 years, it's been used to prop up various other business interests that they have. But they use Manchester as a cash machine. Whatever can develop the most or can produce the most money, they will do it. And it was no surprise at all to see them leading these plans for a Super League, because the Super League promised even greater revenues, and it certainly represented a clash of cultures to an extent, and it was no surprise to see them working together with the American owners of Liverpool, the American owners of Arsenal, who are in it for the same reasons. Their aim here is not to support these football clubs as community assets. They have no interest in the traditions of the club, the cultures around the club, the social importance that these clubs have in their local communities. They have very little interest in the actual sport of football themselves. It's simply a means to an end, that end being to derive as much profit from these companies as possible.
Manchester United fans are here today because they're fuming basically how their football club is being run.
Don't just think it's the Premier League. On Manchester's doorstep, we've seen Bury, Macclesfield Town and Bolton Wanderers fans suffer terribly in recent years, partly because people who are classed as fit and proper persons are allowed to take over football clubs. I don't believe that they are.
You won't have that. Today is what bigger message could be sent to the Glazers by Manchester United fans than stopping the biggest game in English football from happening.
If there's anybody who doesn't...
Now, you could argue, of course, that English clubs, as opposed to German, Austrian, or Swedish clubs, where the majority of the stakes is always supposed to be held by members, have always been associated with corporations, with factories, have had families as owners, have had individuals as owners. What's so different about the Glazers now?
You're right. To an extent, it's like you could argue that the whole enterprise is actually quite hypocritical. Like you said, European football, particularly in Austria, Germany, and Sweden, although not everywhere, it is owned along. It has always been run along membership lines, and it's probably, again, sorry for another day, but in short, a lot of these clubs are historically democratically organised members associations and not-for-profit members organisations. In England, that has never ever been the case. Ever since the very origins of organised and professional football in Great Britain, football clubs have been owned by individuals. Or individuals linked to companies, or vice versa. Owners of there have been various dynasties owning Manchester United, various ownership groups, ownership individuals, going back to the foundation in 1878, and they've never been popular. I think the owners have never been popular. I think that's fair to say. The difference in 2005 was that Potential new owners, the Glazers, would have. The plan was to put the club into debt. Manchester United had always been debt-free, or had been debt-free since the 1930s anyway. The Glazers' plan, which they followed through on, was to borrow just over £600 million in order to purchase the club, and then shift that debt onto the club itself. So the Manchester United went from being debt-free to over £600 million in debt overnight. And I've been paying off that debt ever since, or at least managing that debt ever since. And that's where I come to the figures that I mentioned earlier. That's cost the club upwards of £1 billion in the 17 years since. And I believe that the current figures now, that the debt still stands at around about 500 million. So it's not even gone down. In the past 10 years, Man United have turned over enough money of their own revenue to be able to afford, on the one hand, paying the Glazers over £1 billion, and at the same time wasting another £1 billion plus on really poorly thought through and amateurishly conducted transfers and managerial appointments. While still managing this huge amount of debt tied around our ankle. In the same time period, the owners of Manchester City, just across town, have pumped in the same amount of money, which goes some way to explaining the current difference between the two clubs.
I mean, in some ways, Manchester is a birthplace for modern capitalism in the 19th century, isn't it? Is Manchester ahead of its time here as well? In other words, are there Glazers coming to a club near you if you live in Europe, or to a European club you love if you live in the US? Is this just a sign of the times, and is there more to come, or is this an aberration?
So from their point of view, they would argue that they are ahead of their time. This is an absolutely raging success. From my point of view, it's an aberration. It is very much it's taking to an extreme the levels of pure hyper-capitalism that we've seen in English football since the advent of the Premier League in 1992-93. And that went hand in hand with a series of developments which have gradually dragged the game away from its local. They dragged the clubs away from their local communities. They've priced out people surrounding these clubs, and effectively sacrificed them on the altar of pure money making. And some of those developments that I'm referring to would be, for example, the abolition of standing terraces. Previously, you could stand anywhere on a terrace. Now, a standing ticket at a game costs a lot less than a individual seat at a game. So by scrapping terracing and replacing them with all-seater stadiums, the clubs were suddenly in a position to charge much more money. And that in itself priced out one demographic and attracted a much more moneyed and richer and perhaps slightly easier to control demographic from the point of view of the police. Also particularly following the Hillsborough disaster in 1989, at which 96, I believe, now 97, unfortunately, Liverpool supporters lost their lives. That was used at the time as an excuse, effectively, to portray all football fans as hooligans and therefore justify an increase in police powers and surveillance at football matches.
Yeah. What happened to British fan culture with the introduction of all-seater stadiums and very strict crowd control measures? That's a sad topic for a whole other episode, I think. And yet, there are always signs of hope popping up. New initiatives, new groups, new influences from the continent. And in this case, Manchester United fans didn't take all these developments you described, sitting down either, no pun intended. So let's look at how the resistance looks like here. We should probably say that the Glazer takeover isn't the first attempt here, right? A few years earlier, Sky, the pay-TV station, wants to buy a majority Manchester United. And there's fan resistance and threats to form a whole new fan-owned club. There's calls for government action. And indeed, the government's Monopoly Commission says that a TV station that broadcasts the Premier League can't also own one of its clubs. In 2005, the Glazers come knocking. In this time, there's no intervention. The deal with the debt leveraging you described goes through, and we have not just protests, we suddenly have a new club. We have two Manchester Uniteds, right?
So when the takeover went through, there was certainly a hardcore who said, well, what we're going to do then? We're going to have to go through with the threat. And they did. They formed a new football club, FC United of Manchester, playing in red, white and black with a badge like Man United's, also influenced by the crest of the city of Manchester. And it must be said that at the time, the foundation of FC United completely split this apart. It split the hardcore support in two. And in quite a tragic way. I can't overstate the extent to which it split friends, it split up mates, it split up families. It drove a wedge between people who accused FC United founders on the one hand of being traitors and walking away from their club, and the others on the other hand looking back at those who stayed with Manchester United saying, no, you're the traitors, you've not gone through with it. You're now going to go and support this takeover. So it became quite toxic and extremely emotional on both sides, which continued for a lot of years. Although I would suggest that these days it's the fronts have softened slightly, and the toxicity is no longer there. So those two sets of fans went their own, for the large part, went their own ways. Although nothing's black and white, there have always been grey areas of people who go to both, or who still watch United on TV, or who will keep up to date with FC United's results. There's all sorts of grey areas. Some people might watch FC United home games but go to Man United away games where they're happy that they're not paying Man United money. There's all sorts of grey areas. Personally, in terms of myself, I in 2005, at the time of the takeover, I was only 14. So as much as I remember it happening, I remember my dad explaining to me what was going on. I think I remember appreciating that something was going on, but I think at that age, not really understanding entirely what was happening. However, in about 2008, 2009, I also started going to watch FC United simultaneously. So while watching both clubs, effectively. So I'm an example, I suppose, of somebody who's gone to watch both down the years. And there's, like I said, it really does take all sorts. There were claims at the time, I suppose, that FC United wouldn't last past Christmas. But 17 years later, they're still there. They have their own football ground. They've built their own stadium. And last summer, they actually became European champions in an amateur European Cup organised with alongside other amateur European teams who have gone through similar situations. So they're still going strong.
So there is a trophy that made its way to Manchester in the last years. How am I supposed to imagine this on the streets? Is there overlap? Are there FC United people that show up at anti-Glazer protests? Or is this a final divorce?
The way it actually happened with that Liverpool protest, without going into specific names, there was one particular ringleader who had been heavily involved in the foundation of FC United in 2005, who also played a leading role in organising the protest on that day against Liverpool. And there absolutely were FC United fans, FC United members who turned up outside Old Trafford as part of the protest. I would dispute that people believe that this was a chance to get our club back after all. I don't think people necessarily saw it as that. I think they would turn up for a protest anyway, because getting our club back, that expression, the way that FC United supporters would understand that, would be getting Manchester United back in the way that with an ownership model which they have at FC United. And that ownership model at FC United is entirely member owned, one member, one vote. everybody is a member, everybody is therefore an owner. There is no individual owner of FC United. So from their point of view, getting Manchester United back along that model is pretty utopian. However, if you go to FC United, there is absolutely sympathy for any protest movements at Manchester United. Sympathy and support for those, even though they would certainly claim that, you know, if you're looking for a consistent and successful anti-Glazer protest movement in Manchester, which plays in the colours red, white and black, then it's just here down the road. Come and visit us. So there's certainly that as well. But there's certainly very little bad blood or anything these days. The toxicity's certainly gone out of it, I would argue.
So there is FC United. There's a number of independent fanzines, so magazines from fans for fans, including United We Stand, the one you write for. What other groups are there that Manchester United fans who maybe don't live locally, maybe live here in the US, should know about, that back then galvanized some of that resistance and are still active and are still around?
Other groups at the time were originally IMUSA, so the IMUSA, Independent Manchester United Supporters Association, and they were the leading protagonists behind defeating the B Sky B protest in 1999, and out of them became MUST, MUST, the Manchester United Supporters Trust, who have. Yeah, they've had as they're the official supporters trust, I suppose. Their stated aim, ever since the Glazer takeover, has been to somehow or another work towards ultimately ousting the Glazers, but if not quite that far, working towards establishing some sort of supporter control, some sort of fan stake, some supporter stake in the club. I think a majority stake would be utopian at this stage. But yeah, their aim has been that, and it was MUST, for example, who were behind the green and gold protests, which erupted around about 2010, it must have been 2010-11, which I imagine people might have heard of. There was famous images that went around the world of David Beckham playing for AC Milan at the time, but like against Manchester United at Old Trafford, a Champions League game, donning a green and gold scarf that was thrown at him. And just for the background, the green and gold were the original colours of Manchester United when they were founded as Newton Heath, Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Company. In 1878, they played in green and gold, and these colours were sort of resurrected in 2005 as protest movements, so symbolising, you know, Manchester United's roots and the tradition which the Glazers were trying to exploit. I suppose the reason for the official green and gold campaign in 2010 was at the time a refinancing of the debts, which involved, as I recall, extra debt being loaded onto the club at even higher interest rates, which people saw as even more of a threat to the financial health and future of Manchester United at the time. So those protests took place around then, and interestingly, because a lot of people, you often hear the accusation that, Manchester United fans protesting against the Glazers, they're only doing it because they're not very good. They're only doing it because they're losing. They're only doing it because the team's not doing very well. In 2010, that was in the middle of a period where Manchester United had just won 3 Premier League titles on the trot, and in a period where United reached 3 Champions League finals in 4 years, winning one of them. So this was absolutely not a period in which Manchester United were doing badly. Manchester United were doing extremely well, and still the protests were at one of their most virulent high points. So yeah, that was MUST, MUST, green and gold. Mm-hmm. I suppose people nowadays, in the immediate term, over the past season or the current season, people will have been aware of a new group calling themselves the 1958. 1958 referring to the year of the air crash in Munich, when several Manchester United players and a number of journalists lost their lives on the way back from a European Cup match in Belgrade. The name itself is actually quite controversial in some quarters. People, is that really a suitable date? But whatever, the name is what it is. The group have been behind some of they've been behind the protest, the more direct street protests that we've seen before certain games. Before certain games this season. I think, in general, there's a lot of groundswell of support for them. I think there's always support, especially from us at the fanzines. There's always support for anybody who tries to put their head above the parapet and do something, and particularly do something in real life, because it's all very easy for people to complain about the Glazers or complain about whatever on the internet with hashtags and tweets and whatever it might be. It's a very different kettle of fish trying to organise something with real people in real life on the ground, especially with this, so many competing factions and people all having their own opinions. It's very difficult to organise people. I think there's a lot of respect for them trying to get organised and doing that. Having said that, there has been criticism of some of the methods which they've used. I think, namely, they managed to, people at least claiming to be related to them, managed to sit down with the new chief executive Richard Arnold recently at a local pub, and then proceeded to effectively undermine the chief executive's trust by secretly filming the conversation, which I think was seen in some quarters not a particularly trustworthy way of going about any sort of serious negotiation. So they earned some criticism for that, actually coming right up to date. We have a couple of articles in the very latest edition of United We Stand, one written by myself and one coincidentally written by a colleague, and this is without discussing it previously, but pretty much writing the same thing. That the way the protest was conducted ahead of the recent Liverpool game was actually quite interesting in the way that it differed from the protests in 2005. Namely that in 2005, the original Glazer takeover, the message on all the banners, the slogan everywhere was "United, not for sale." However, this time, just last month, the message on the banner was "United for sale." And it's a pretty key difference, isn't it? And there are certainly elements, and I include myself among that, who I think, I'm all for the protests. I've got a lot of respect for anyone who will put their head above the parapet like that, and all power to them. But I thought the messaging was pretty unedifying. I think Manchester United supporters, coming from a city like Manchester with an industrial and socialist history, I think it's quite unedifying to be going out there with a banner begging to be bought. I think there are higher ideals which we could strive for, and to make matters worse, emblazoned upon this banner next to the words was actually the face of Sir Jim Ratcliffe, a British billionaire, I believe the richest man in Britain, and owner of the Ineos cycling team, and also Nice in France, French team. To be begging another billionaire, about whom we don't know that much, to simply buy our club, as bad as the Glazers are, I thought that was a slightly unedifying message to be sending. I think there are, and this is, I suppose, drifting slightly perhaps into the realm of opinion, that there are higher ideals we could strive for there, and one of them is currently being promoted by the Manchester United Supporters Trust, and the idea of a fan share scheme whereby the supporters via the trust would have some sort of minor stake in the club with equal voting rights to the Glazers, to at least give us a say at the table.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned in particular that these protests, as much as it may look like it on the outside, aren't fundamentally about how the team is performing on the pitch, right? It'd be easy to conclude from an onlooker's perspective that protests at Manchester United or at West Ham against the owners there are closely linked to how well the team is doing or not. You highlighted that protests were going on while the team was doing really well. So there clearly is something else at stake here. If you look to the future a little bit, what are realistic scenarios and how to move forward here? Germany has this 50+1 rule, right? Where there's 50% plus one vote in a professional club. Corporation that plays in the Bundesliga is supposed to be held by members of the club. That model doesn't have a particular kind of tradition in England, but are there other models to move forward, especially in light of the Super League, when even the British government has said, well, we need to get an independent regulator in here, the thing has gotten out of hand, and we need to find some ways to get fans involved at the table. How realistic is that? And what are concrete goals for the future years here?
I think a lot of the current things being suggested are ultimately utopian. However, that doesn't mean that these ideas should be thrown out there, discussed and debated, and you have to start somewhere. First of all, the idea of 50+1. You mentioned earlier, again, we can't go into too many details. We'd be here all day, and I believe it's a different podcast episode anyway. There has been an increasing awareness of that model in English football, I think, over the past maybe 6 or 7 years, as I suppose social media has grown, internet communications have grown. Particularly before the pandemic, there were so many cheap flights to Germany, and the amount of British fans that you would see travelling to Germany on any given Bundesliga match day to see any Bundesliga team was going up. I could absolutely guarantee that you could go to any German football match on any Saturday, and I guarantee you would bump into British football fans visiting for the weekend. Often because the flights were so cheap, you could often get flights cheap enough, accommodation cheap enough to go to Germany for the weekend for the price of an Arsenal match ticket.
Wow.
And that's not an exaggeration. You often heard that, particularly from fans in London who would say, it's cheaper to come here for a weekend. Flights, accommodation, food, maybe go to 2 or even 3 matches for the price of one Premier League match.
It used to be the other way around, right? German fans traveling to England in the 80s and 90s to kind of pick up fan culture by osmosis there, and that's shifted a bit, right?
It's funny how these things switch around. I mean, you also get German fans traveling these days and actually coming back quite disappointed at what they've encountered in the UK. Because they've often travelled there with these ideas of the great old standing terraces of the Kop at Anfield, or the Stretford End at Old Trafford, or the Holt End at Villa Park, and they come back quite disappointed that, oh, hang on, my ticket cost £60. I had to sit down, there was no atmosphere, and I wasn't allowed to drink a beer in my seat, and they come back quite disappointed. To go back to, like I said, there has been this growing appreciation that there is this model in Germany that allows the tickets to be cheaper, that allows the atmosphere to be better, that allows a greater sense of ownership, and that ultimately, at least in part, prevented Dortmund and Borussia Dortmund and Bayern Munich joining the Super League. At least in part, not entirely, but it certainly did play a role. Whether there's an absolutely nailed on understanding of the 50+1 rule among English fans, with all due respect to a lot of my own mates, I would dispute that, and I know it's complicated and I know it's boring. That's why I make it my job to try and make it less boring, but I do understand how dry it can be. And there were placards and banners at that Liverpool protest that we started on, with all sorts of formulations: 51+1, 49+2, 53 minus something. I had to laugh a little bit, but I suppose ultimately the point was there. Ultimately, the awareness of a different ownership model, of something different being possible. Ultimately, that was there, and that's not to be scoffed at. I think that's probably the core message. However, would that ever be possible in Premier League football? I think, unfortunately, the answer is, as far as I understand it, no, absolutely not. No, it wouldn't be possible. If we look at the way German fans see it, German fans, constantly protesting to defend 50+1, to defend the status quo, to keep their ownership system. They are keeping hold of equity in their clubs, which they already have. They don't want to give it away. how would you introduce 50+1 in the UK or in English football? That would involve stripping equity away from owners. Why should they do that? The only way to do it would be via government legislation. But then you also have the question, why on earth should the British government do that? Particularly the current government, and particularly the previous Prime Minister who was in power at the time of the Super League, who made quite a big populist deal of saying, oh, I'm against the Super League, this is disgraceful, we have to protect our clubs, and yes, we're going to have an independent regulator, we're going to hand back control to the fans, yes, fantastic. If you look at it realistically, why on earth should Mr. Johnson have been interested in stripping equity away from billionaire investors in a major British industry? This is precisely the sort of thing that his government stands for, or at least stood for. I don't see any particular change with the new Prime Minister either. So a lot of that was very much just, I think, probably posturing and vote-winning populism, perhaps. So that's why I think, to be more realistic, I think, again, going back to Manchester United as the example, one option is to beg another billionaire, be it Sir Jim Ratcliffe, be it the Saudi Arabia Sovereign Wealth Fund, be it a Chinese consortium, be it whoever, to buy out the Glazers. Okay, that's one solution. The other solution, like I said, is to strive for, and it has already been discussed with the club, it's very much in its infancy, but it has been discussed, a potential fan share scheme. It wouldn't wrest back control of the club to us immediately, but it would, if done correctly, and it's difficult, it would assure a seat on the table. And so, while 50+1 in terms of Germany might not be possible, or the sort of fan ownership model, one owner, one vote, as seen at FC United, at the amateur level, while that might not be possible in the Premier League, I think another model certainly is possible.
Well, as we come to an end here, I have two listeners' question for you. One is coming from Victor Newberg, who actually is the men's soccer coach at the college I work at. He is wondering what has been neglected in the club and to what extent. It's massive spending in the transfer market, but he has heard reports that Old Trafford is crumbling and Carrington is no longer the pinnacle of training facilities in the league. What's going on there?
Yes, good question. And again, it comes back to something I mentioned before about the accusation of Manchester United fans. How can you complain about the Glazers when you've just bought Cristiano Ronaldo back, or you've just spent £1 billion on transfers over the last 10 years? You bought Paul Pogba back, you bought Angel Di Maria, Radamel Falcao, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Jadon Sancho. You're spending all this money. Clearly the Glazers are putting money in. Well, the answer to that, first of all, is no, they're not. It's Manchester United's own money. That's not Glazers. The Glazers never put a single cent into Manchester United. That's our own money. The problem with the Glazers is that it's not as bad as the debt is, and as bad as the dividends are. I think there's a case to be argued that the actual more important and more fundamental problem is the neglect of the structures at the club of Manchester United. And by that, I mean the personnel structures, i.e. not having the right professional sporting experts in place within the personnel hierarchy to make the right decisions on squad building, on managerial appointments, on recruitment, on scouting, on youth development. Man United, those personnel hierarchies have been completely neglected over the past 10 years, which leads as a consequence to, like I said, over £1 billion being wasted on poorly thought through and poorly conducted transfers. However, there's also as the question suggested, the physical neglect of physical infrastructure. That includes Old Trafford. Old Trafford is still the biggest club stadium in English football. However, it's not been expanded since 2006. Admittedly, 1 year after the Glazer takeover. However, those expansions were signed off before the Glazer takeover. Since then, that increased capacity to, I think at the time, 76,000. It's actually since been reduced to about 73,000. That's to do with an increased disabled section in accordance with Premier League rules, so that the capacity has actually gone down slightly. However, yeah, like you said, the questioner is right to say that Old Trafford is falling down in comparison to more modern arenas. It's no longer the most modern football arena in the UK. Manchester City Stadium is more modern, although it was gifted to them by the council, but that's another topic for another day. Tottenham Hotspur Stadium is obviously the most modern, the most new. You look at the grounds like the Emirates, or even more modern new builds like Southampton or Leicester. Or even plans that Chelsea had to redevelop, although they've temporarily been shelved, I believe. Liverpool have been redeveloping Anfield. There are probably half a dozen major football grounds in the UK which are much more modern than Old Trafford. You literally had that quite damning images from a couple of years ago before a derby at home against Manchester City. Where the rain was literally pouring through a hole in the roof. And if anyone's ever been to Manchester, we don't have that much sun, so having holes in the roof is a major problem. Yeah. Also Carrington, the training ground, was also mentioned. It's not been upgraded in ages. It has been rumoured suggested in some quarters that it's been a factor in turning certain players off when they visited the training ground and seeing it, and it's not been quite up to scratch. It was absolutely a reason for a mass departure on the women's side of the game at Manchester United last season. The women's manager Casey Stoney and several of her players. Including a couple of American internationals, leaving, basically complaining that the investment in the training infrastructure, particularly for the women's side, simply wasn't up to scratch. So all of this infrastructure, personnel-wise and physically, has been neglected, and that is arguably an even bigger problem than the debt that the Glazers have put on the club. It's the general neglect.
Yeah. Second question, and I got this from more than one person. Dan Kublikti is one of them. How can we, in the United States, who are not in Manchester, help get the Glazers out?
I think any support is obviously good, and Manchester United support is global. Saw that with my own eyes in Thailand this summer, and it never ever ceases to just amaze me. We all grow up knowing that Manchester United are big, knowing that Man United is well known. Anywhere we go in the world, you say you're from Manchester, people immediately go Man United, Wayne Rooney, Alex Ferguson, and it's fantastic. However, it's when you see it with your own eyes, and I've seen it with my own eyes in Bangkok and in Singapore, when you actually see tens of thousands of people supporting this football club that you've grown up next to, then you realise just how massive it is. So there's absolutely a role to be played. I think the key is awareness of which channels of protest are the most genuine. Well, not even the most genuine, but which ones are genuine, which ones are real. Interesting example from the recent Liverpool game where I said there was that banner with Ratcliffe's face on it. There was a big organised protest march. That had been organised by people on the ground, by the 1958, for example. Simultaneously, a hashtag, I believe, started doing the rounds on the internet, calling on people to hashtag empty Old Trafford. This gave the impression that this was part of the plan. However, there was absolutely zero plan ever to actually boycott the game. I mean, whether you like it or not, that was not the plan. However, this hashtag doing the rounds gave a lot of people the impression that this was the plan. So that's what I mean by genuine channels of influence and other, I suppose, unofficial channels of protest, which ultimately might have a big impact online, but have no impact in real life. I think an awareness of which fan groups and supporter institutions actually have a say on the ground is important. See a lot of comments regarding, why don't various protest groups get some of the fan YouTube channels involved? And the simple answer is that these fan YouTube channels, they're simply not represented on the ground. They're simply not present on the ground. And even the ones that are don't have any standing or any influence or any stature within the hardcore match going real life support. So there's absolutely no point in communicating with channels like that who simply, I suppose, as far as people on the ground are concerned, don't really exist. It's irrelevant. So again, I would say make yourself aware of the Manchester United Supporters Trust, MUST. You can sign up there as a member, or even just as to the email newsletter to keep informed. Keep an eye on what the 1958 do. Like I said, don't necessarily agree with all their methods personally, but absolutely support anyone trying to get organised. Sign up to the fanzines, United We Stand and Red News. Follow them. That's the sort of place where you'll get genuine information which has a genuine impact on the ground. So for the time being, that's probably about it. Actually, it's quite a narrow group, but that's it. The key is, the key is to differentiate between the organisations, groups which actually have a real life impact and those that don't.
Yes, and there are organisations that do make a difference on the ground for every Premier League team now. Most do have a supporters trust now. Many of those trusts are pushing for fan share models that are similar to what Matt has outlined for Manchester United as well. So while we were focusing on that particular club today, if you're listening to this, you are a fan of another Premier League team, you've gotten your introduction to European soccer through Premier League and through a team there, or maybe a favorite player, and you're ready to step a little bit beyond that and beyond watching on a weekend, there are avenues for supporters, even abroad, to get involved and to help make a difference on the ground. I think it's worth some time, it's worth some effort. And the dividend for that is, I think, a sense of belonging and also a sense of change to maybe not the whole global football structure, but to your club and to the kind of community that has chosen you or that you have chosen. Do look into that and see what is happening in the ecosystem of supporter culture of your particular club as well. All right, Matt, is there anything that we haven't raised that you would still want to bring up in the last minute here?
Not that I can think of. My throat's almost dry, so yeah, I think we've probably spoken enough.
Good. Well, that's a good sign then, and we will sign off and have a drink. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good to me. Thanks very much, Philip.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Thanks a lot.